I think I speak for all of us here tonight in this splendid setting that we've been very much enriched and perhaps in ways reassured by your reading of the scriptures and your reading of the broad sweep of history. So thank you very much for sharing some of your, just a small bit of your vast knowledge of the great religions of our world. Let me situate a first question in the world in which we live. It's often said in general terms that we live in a world in which countries in the West, largely Judeo-Christian societies, the religion matters less in terms at least of the religions of the book. And yet in other parts of the world, the religion matters more, often in terms of Islam or particular interpretations of Islam. Now, it may not be so neat a binary divide, but there are trends, and I'm wondering whether you see danger in these trends.
I think America, religion is very important in America. Not always great religion. You know, they've got their own intolerance, but there's a lot to a very, really interesting, significant thinking, religious thinking in America. And they mind about it. And I'm told that in some cases, religion in America is the second most religious country in the world after India. Religion's hard to do well. And a lot of them, like it's an art form. I do see religion as an art form. It is about the discovery of meaning, and it expresses itself best in terms of art, in music, poetry, painting, the architecture, as we see here.
And politics in contemporary terms. One would say evangelical Christian in America is becoming more and more political.
Oh, that is true, but with not a very compassionate politics. That's the point. I'm all for people getting political if it means they're going to work for a more compassionate, equal world. And indeed, our reading of scriptures should compel us to work for that. And that may need politics, that you need justice, and that every single human being should be as seen as sacred. But of course, you can a lot of this right-wing stuff, it's exploited by the government too. But it's not that that religion is making them do this. The religions are telling them to be compassionate. But we reuse it. But religion is very important to.
If you look at Europe, Britain, how they talk about Britain.
Oh, yeah, Britain, I think, is entirely unreligious.
Please say something nice about Britain. I really need to.
You know, it's one of the worst markets for my books. But I don't mind that because I get left alone to do my work, so that's fine. But things are very different, you know, when I go to Holland. That's the second biggest market for me after the United States. Now, we always think of the Dutch as being extremely secular, and indeed they are, but they understand religion in the way the British just don't. It's been left, I think, I come from Ireland, you see, originally, my people, so that's very, very different. But the British, I just don't think, get it at all. And I'm not sure that we ever did, really. I think we were always, it's an art form at which we didn't excel. Just as some nations have wonderful painting and music. We haven't had much of this. We have very fine literature in Britain. But religion we didn't do. And even back, we were always, and we're the first to start with the Enlightenment, and Newton was ours, and all this. So that was Britain. But the Dutch, that's the second biggest market for me after in that tiny little country. They outsell the British by 15-1, and they ask really good questions. They understand it. And they are involved. Similarly, I had an extraordinary time in Brussels just a few months ago. And I thought, well, this is going to be a bit grim, but the place was packed. And the people were moved. And so
you think if there's no Brexit, Britain will become more religious?
Oh, no. No. Brexit is their new religion, I think. But just because nationalism is seen as like sport, is a kind of religiosity.
I'm just wondering, since you seem to find such hope and reassurance in religion, and you've seen everything that's gone before, you began by talking about nationalism. And I think everyone here tonight worries about the rise of nationalism, the emphasis on the other. But when you look at the sometimes violent nationalisms of today, with the rise of sometimes violent Islamophobia, when you look at it in the vast sweep of history, does it seem particularly troublesome now?
Violence, you mean?
Just this phase that we're going through. Some people ask, is this a phase or is this the new normal?
I think it's a little bit different because I think we're on the cusp of major change. You see, the nation state is looking increasingly creaky because it's not needed much anymore, and we're becoming more and more global because we are interlinked as the human race as never before on the World Wide Web. This is what our economies are profoundly interconnected. When stocks fall in one part of the world, stocks plummet all around the world that day. We all face the same environmental catastrophe, and we are retreating from that into these ghettos, a sort of safety thing. And the same is happening in religion. You see, the more we discover about other faiths, because before people who didn't travel much, they might have heard a few weird and wonderful things happening in India, but they had no idea what was going on. But now, since the early 19th century, we've had a chance to see the profundity of these faiths. And the profound unanimity, as well as the fascinating, revealing, and interesting differences. And a lot of people don't like that, again, in the same way, just as it's a sort of Brexit thing. You know, Brexit is a sort of nationalism gone berserk, and in the face of an encroaching globalization. And similarly, people retreat into denominational ghettos and become fundamentalists. And it's significant that the first fundamentalist movement occurred in the United States at this juncture when ecumenism was becoming, I mean, we're talking ecumenism simply about talking to other Christians, you know, like Catholics, not Muslims or anything exotic of that sort, but still there was this retreat, and I think we're on a cusp of change where we don't know how we're going to manage our global world, how we're going to manage the failing environment,
and so on. Yes,
and Brexit. This ridiculous remark that people make about...
I'll be doing a great favor to our audience if I concentrate too much on Brexit tonight. People came tonight to get away from Brexit, I think. But I have to say that I was a bit troubled when you gave your very learned interpretation that God wasn't up there at a desk in the heavens worrying about things. But it may explain why, as a university student in Canada, he didn't respond to my pleas for help on my essays.
No, you wouldn't.
Let me open the floor to your questions. Maybe you, Your Highness, you'd like to ask something. You who preach tolerance on so many occasions. I think we have microphones as well.
I'm interested in the relationship between pluralism and monotheism. Because many of the societies around the world are facing that issue.
Yes, I know that.
The relationship between pluralism and monotheism.
You know, one God. It depends, as I was trying to say in my speech, how you see God. You see, if you see God as your in that way of a being, one single being up there, who had all other gods as false. And idols, then yes, you are in a bind, and that's why it's important to stretch to realize that what we call God is not simply a being. Thomas Aquinas and people, the cloud of unknowing, Ibn Sina, Maimonides, they knew that. They knew that we're not talking about a being in the sky, someone up there who only likes this particular people. But of course you can abuse this and say that God is on my side. That certainly is the case. And yet, you know, I wonder if these people ever read their scriptures. I mean, Jesus, for example, was an anarchic human being. He didn't observe the boundaries. He was continually offending people by going out and crossing barriers, constantly crossing barriers, always having the wrong people to dinner, consorting with women who were seen to be impure, beyond the pale, or women in adultery, to take them like that, reaching across the barriers. And, you know, and I remember an imam in Washington, Imam Majid, invited a whole lot of conservative members of Congress to listen to me once. I said, thanks very much. And one of them said, you know, Miss Armstrong, you know, what do you say about Jesus when he said, you know, no one comes to the Father but through me? And I said, well, now look, just think of this man. Constantly, as I was saying, reaching across boundaries, doing the wrong thing, offending everybody in sight in order to reach out to all. And you have the timidity to say that if he came back now and saw the state of our world, he would say prissily, sorry, no one comes to the Father but through. This is not right. And it's where you need to know a little bit about scriptural history. And about how that comes in one gospel, which is a gospel, John's gospel, which is having problems, not with Jews but with other Christians. And they're having a fight. And this is John's Jesus. And that it's much more complex. And you see, I think the Quran, as I said, has this extraordinarily broad outreach. That state where the Quran says, as I quoted, that if it had been our will for you all to be in one single ummah, we would have done it. But this was not our will. And you have the Sufis, who have, and I know they're not in vogue in some parts of the world, but they have an outstanding appreciation, like Ibn Arabi, of the validity of other faiths. Because once you've glimpsed the divine, then you've left these man-made distinctions behind. But all too often we put fences on God because of our own insecurity. It makes us feel good, and it swells our ego because we're on the right side. I mean, I grew up like this. I mean, I grew up a Catholic, and we didn't even think Protestants were and neither did they think we were. And we didn't go to. We lived in a kind of ghetto in Birmingham, a ghetto of Irish. We were all of Irish descent. Went to Catholic schools, could sort of had dances and clubs and church together, and felt that we were a sacred enclave. Well, I no longer think that anymore, as you may have gathered.
Let's take another question. Yes, Rory Stewart, yes. Rory Stewart, yes.
Very interested in your personal experience when you first began discussing Islam, and whether you ever felt nervous moving on to that territory, whether you were ever concerned about offending people, and whether you've actually been in debate with Salafis and what happens when you get into those kinds of discussions.
Well, I began by my interest in Islam was with Palestinians in Jerusalem. So they were my friends, and that was fine. I wrote my first biography of the Prophet as I was telling His Highness earlier, at the time of the Salman Rushdie crisis, because I felt that my own people didn't know anything about the Prophet, and all they knew was what Salman was telling them. And we couldn't find a publisher because everybody thought that I would be joining Salman in hiding, that the Muslims would be out. But the Muslims, I was amazed by the fact that the Muslims took it to their hearts. And I must say that I've experienced extraordinary generosity. There are times, however, when I went to Malaysia, for example, my books are banned there.
Oh.
And yet the whole thing was so contradictory because my books are banned, but the government paid my first-class airfare and actually gave me a dinner in my honor. And they were, and the people, and of course you can't ban books in this day and age of Amazon and the internet. And the audience were coming up defiantly waving their books under the nose of the officials who, you know, so there was that funny thing, but there were people who said I shouldn't be talking about Islam because I had no, I was not a Muslim, and but I've rather steered clear. I've not gone to Saudi Arabia, for example. And
have you been invited?
I was once, but it was such a peremptory invitation. It was like, get on a plane on Friday, economy. So I mean, I thought, you know, this does not sound a pleasant invitation.
What about Al-Aqsa in Egypt?
Oh, I've been there.
Al-Aqsa,
I've been there,
yeah.
and in fact, Al-Aqsa invited me back to speak to the students, the dean of Al-Aqsa. And he had my book, and he said, anybody who could write this is a friend of Islam, and I had his photograph taken with me. So that was no problem. Al-Aqsa was no problem. It was interesting, though. They held at Al-Aqsa, I think, the first interfaith conference they'd ever had. And so a whole lot of the suspects, Esposito and people like me, went over there. We were all on the stage together. And there the anger in the hall came out. There we were representing the West, and they were slamming away. But when you got off the platform, they all wanted their photographs taken and, for me to sign their books. But we represented the West at that point. And so that was there.
I think we have time for one more question. So the pressurists have a very good question. I see Ed Mortimer there. I could take a gamble that it might be a very good question.
And generally, we didn't talk about tolerance for precisely the reason you said, that it seemed to have this slightly de haut en bas approach. And he generally, in his speeches, talked about mutual respect between people of different views and opinions and faiths. Later, I had another privilege, which was to be the rapporteur for a group of eminent persons from the Council of Europe, chaired by Joschka Fischer, who was the former foreign minister of Germany. And the same point came up, and I said, I think, well, rather than tolerance, we ought to say mutual respect. And he said, do I have to respect bigots? What should I have answered to him?
That is a good question. I think you respect their right to think what they do, as they do, but not accept the way they speak or behave to others. And you have to see where the bigots have come from. I used to be a kind of bigot years ago because I'd been injured by religion. As a young woman, and I was very, very angry about religion and hated it. So, but then that was quite normal in Britain. So for once, I fitted in. But that experience, see where they've come from, and accept behave to them with courtesy, but do not, when they are, if they attack a mosque or utter blasphemous remarks in order to offend, you don't accept that because it's hurting other people. I think you respect the person, because you never know what has caused someone. Each human being is a mystery with a history of pain and discomfort that we'll probably never know. So accept that, but don't accept the deeds that they do. Those you can say quite distinctly, that to defame others, to insult others, that is not acceptable. But do not start hating them. That's a form of respect, I think.
Karen, just one last word for you. From all of what you have drawn, both negative and positive, your most latest project about compassion and the Charter,
Yeah.
has that left you with greater hope?
Yes and no. Yes and no. Sometimes it's been quite frustrating because, especially in the United States, we've got sort of nothing is happening in the UK, of course. There's nothing, not a nibble of interest, and my friends' eyes glaze with boredom when I mention it. But in the United States, there's a great enthusiasm for it, and everybody is very, very keen to make. We have got a load of compassionate cities going. Now, my dream was always to twin some of these cities, so that you have a city in the United States twinned with, say, Amman in the Middle East, say Seattle and Amman, because Seattle is very keen to, Amman was very keen to team up with Seattle, and so that they could exchange news. The people in the schools and universities could exchange emails and form email friendships, and some of the misapprehensions we have about each other could be laid to rest. I cannot get any of them to do it. They just want their little city to be a nice, compassionate city. But you see, what keep on thinking of the concentric circles of the Confucians, that you must spread out from your own city to the whole world. But last week I was in Pakistan. And that is where I'm now convinced that is where the hope of the Charter is.
Oh.
Some extraordinary work has been.
Everyone here who knows Pakistan, their eyes just opened wide.
I know.
Given what they're happening with the Ahmadis and the Shia
I know,
Sunni
and that's why, because
Hashwani, you mentioned about Hashwani.
It's him. I've been working with him, and for some 10 years. And what he's done, these schools, he's got the government working on these schools. There are now over 21,000 children going through this compassionate education, which was not just evolved by some goodies, but was devised by leading educationalists to introduce compassionate teaching into core subjects of the curriculum. And we started a new endeavour last week as I opened. Amin noticed that, there's massive disparity of wealth. He noticed that these big flyovers, bridges, that underneath there was all this space. So he got the city council to agree to do it up. Oh. They had to get rid of all the rubble and the drug addicts and all that. The street children are living under these bridges. Now they've been. The first one was opened last week. I opened it, and it's a state of the art. The students from the university will come and teach kids there who don't go to school.
Oh, very good.
They have put up. The traffic is roaring around overhead, but they've put up soundproofing, and the rooms are all painted beautifully. But they can play cricket in there. They're going to teach the girls soccer, but they're also waiting to see what this community actually needs. There was one rickshaw driver who is going to be crucial to this endeavour, because the Pakistani pedestrians must be the bravest in the world crossing roads. But they want to see, this rickshaw driver made a speech and he wept openly. And he said, you know, we've had nowhere to go. Oh. Nowhere to go. And but they're waiting to see what this community needs, not coming in to impose it. And he's got permission to do this with 5 other bridges in the city, but this is. They've also got a program for empowering women, teaching them a skill, but in a compassionate setting. And I went into the Aga Khan Children's Hospital, where they've adopted my 12 Steps to a Compassionate Life for a program to help nurses and doctors get on with one another, and to help the children, because that's always a problem, and to help the children are now improving. The children who've been through nursing in this compassionate way are going home several days earlier. Now, I asked him when I left, I said, would you start linking up with some other cities? Sure, he said. So we've got lots of cities in Indonesia. They've got their problems at the moment, but I'd like to link up with them and with Oman and various others. We've also had an invitation to go into the UAE, the two of us, to work with them on their
they have a tolerance
and pluralism. Yeah. So they came to me and asked if we would go. So we'll be going in November.
Well, thank you.
So
yes.
I see compassion coming from the Muslim world. That is where the hope of the Charter is. That's where we may have a comeback.
Well, I think I thank you from all of us for ending with a positive story of hope. I think we all need it, and I think all of us are very grateful, not just for the time and the thought you put into tonight's lecture, but for imparting some of the wisdom on your own spiritual journey over so many years, manifested in your writing and in your talks. But I'm going to leave the thanks to someone who is a very distinguished Canadian, an author, a broadcaster, a former Governor General of Canada. She is a member of the board of the Global Centre for Pluralism. She also co-founded a very important institute in Canada called the Institute for Canadian Citizenship. And even more than that, something that matters in Canada, she established the Clarkson Cup for hockey, women's hockey. Ladies and gentlemen, the Right Honourable Adrienne Clarkson.
First of all, I want to thank you personally, Karen, for this wonderful encounter with you. So direct, so personal, so felt. And I'm going to tell my husband, too, that you condemn the Westphalian nation state, which is one of the things that he really believes should be condemned at all times. After having read your books and having seen your trajectory as a person of faith, as a person who wants people to understand each other through the prisms of what we already have and what we know or we think we know. It is deeply, deeply appreciated to see how you syncretize all of this and make it possible for us to understand it. You know, there's a great Canadian author, Margaret Lawrence, who is one of our greatest authors. She died about 20 years ago. She said before she died, what I think is the definition of compassion: if I could leave one thought with you, it would be that you feel in your heart's core the reality of others. And to me, I've never found a definition of compassion that matches that, because it takes away the mushy, pity, gooey stuff, which has nothing to do with how we should feel about child poverty in our very rich cities. In Toronto, for instance, where a number of us live, and is a wonderful city, we have something like 6,000 children living in shelters at night. We cannot afford not to have breakfast programs in our schools because so many children come to school otherwise not able to learn because they haven't had food in the morning. And this is in one of the richest and most developed countries in the world, a highly sophisticated political system, and lots of talk about things that we should be doing. And the work that you do, the way in which you look at what has formed us as a human race, religions, we can call it that, belief systems, but I think what you talked about tonight, that it is really about the nature of Godhead. And the nature of Godhead is that it is pervasive. It is something that we feel instinctively but don't have the words for. And I think what you're doing, which to paraphrase, it has been described by you as ethical alchemy, which is that there is a transformation. Transformation is what we need in order to understand where it is that we must go now. We are fond of saying we're living terrible times, and everybody has always lived in terrible times. I myself feel, because my own life was so transformed by war, by the nature of fascism, and my whole family, and the way in which we lived and was so transformed by that, that I think, am I going to be bracketed by the beginning of my life by fascism and by the end of my life by fascism? Is that what it means? Is that what 2 generations means, actually? So I worry about this, and others worry with me. But when I hear somebody like you and see how you have moved from not only your own pain and suffering, but also through the development of your intellectual and spiritual capacities, to be able to give to us that nature and that feeling of what transformation can be and can do for us, I want to thank you so much, and we will take it away with us.